Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is, I'm Peter Whittle. Now, throughout this pandemic, many of us have been extremely, bewildered and disturbed by some of the images coming out of Australia and how Australia seemingly seems to have dealt with the pandemic. So I'm very pleased that today we have with us someone who knows Australia very well. She's indeed Australian. Helen Dale, who now lives in England, is an award-winning novelist, journalist, and indeed lawyer. Thank you very much for coming, Helen.
Hello, Peter. How are you? I'm very pleased to be here.
It's great to have you. Before actually we go and talk about Australia, Helen, I just wonder, we're recording this on a Friday. This week they brought in these new restrictions, this Plan B thing. Will you be going along with Plan B?
In a sense that it's not really difficult for me to go along with Plan B because I'm one of these people that's able to work from home and they haven't extended it to hospitality.
Right.
So you don't have the mask wearing or any of those kind of issues. So it's one of those, it's a theoretical question for me. Yeah. So whenever I've commented on COVID regulations of whatever sort, I've always had to be conscious of the fact that I am one of those people who throughout COVID has had a relatively easy life. Yeah. The only impost on me has been not being able to travel. The last time I went overseas was in January, February 2020, and my partner and I were actually in South Africa.
Right, really?
So, so we haven't travelled this year, and that has been annoying. Yeah. We booked a trip to Israel. We thought we would get a nice sunny holiday in Israel, and Israel shut the borders, and we had to cancel the trip that we were going to go to Israel. So,
but where sort of are you on the broad spectrum of opinion about all of this? I mean, you know, are you anti-vaccine passports, for example, or you know, I mean, where do you sit on the line, as it were?
When a lot of the restrictions first started coming in to the lockdowns and particularly the lockdowns, that's the thing I found particularly alarming, precisely because many people like me with my advantages and being a professional member of the upper middle classes who could work from home, that kind of thing, I was acutely aware that I lived in this nice house in the countryside with a big garden. And I saw people like me criticising, the one I really remember is criticising Londoners in tiny flats for going to the park and lying in the sun.
Oh,
So what I found really alarming about the pandemic restrictions originally was the blindness of people who can have an easy life during lockdown to those people who can't have an easy life. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing is the opposition that I had to the rules that were developed around the management of the pandemic were not based on scientific arguments. And I think the lockdown skeptics of various sorts made a mistake when they tried to turn the debate into science against science. So you had the government scientists and you had the group of heterodox scientists, say, but they all were scientists and in some cases they would agree. I didn't enter into that, apart from very occasionally getting really cross with journalists not being able to be numerate about things. So we get basic mathematical and statistical things wrong. I used to be a corporate solicitor, and one area of the profession that does mean lawyers have a reputation for working with words, which is fair enough, but one branch of the profession where you do actually have to be very numerate and good at doing calculations in your head and that kind of thing is corporate finance and corporate law. That's where I used to work. And so I got very cross about that at times. And I did start to get news outlets writing to me saying, can you write a piece on epidemiology? And I would finish up having to say, I can comment on the maths because that's what I can do, but I can't comment on the biology or the genetics because I stopped doing biology at O-level. I didn't even do an A-level in it. I did an A-level in maths, so it's kind of consistent with someone who's good at maths. So my opposition to it was the problem with the lack of parliamentary scrutiny and the attacks on civil liberties. And I spoke a number of times to a number of media outlets along those lines, but I would not venture into the science aspect of it because I'm what's known as an ethical pluralist. So I don't think it's possible to rank all values on a single scale. I think there are opposed sets of values that are equally valuable, and the approach that you will take to ordering civil society will be based on which sets of values you think are most important to you. And to me, as you would expect from someone who is a lawyer, who has worked for a parliamentarian in Australia with a strong commitment to civil liberties himself, Senator Lionhelm, before he was elected to Parliament, one of the things he was known for example, was being a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War. So I was coming out of that tradition, and so when I articulated criticism, it was based on civil liberties, not on science. I think it is possible, both for someone who's very pro-science, to reject a civil liberties argument because their value structure is different. And I also think that goes in the other direction. It's possible for someone who's got a strong commitment to civil liberties to reject a scientific argument on the basis that they think civil liberties are more important. And I don't think you can rank those two things on a common scale. It's not something that's amenable to trade-offs.
It's interesting, though, that actually, I see your point, but what's interesting, at least in Britain, I don't know if you felt this, is that the sort of people who would usually be very keen to talk about civil liberties, like liberty itself, you know, are noticeable by their absence. They've almost said nothing about this. The people who seem to be most worried about civil liberties are people, broadly speaking, on the conservative side of things, you know, broadly speaking. But in fact, the people who generally talk about human rights and about civil liberties have been noticeable by their absence.
I think part of that is to do with the fact that a lot of contemporary human rights organisations, they do human rights, they don't do civil liberties. Those things are not the same. And the reason they're not the same is it comes back to the point about moral ranking. When I talked about being an ethical pluralist, I am drawing on ideas developed by Isaiah Berlin. And Isaiah Berlin was the one who pointed out that there are different forms of liberty. And the Tories who have been in favour of civil liberties, you know, assembly and speech and so on and so forth, are making arguments in favour of negative liberties, which are the traditional removal of restraint style of liberties. Whereas the human rights organisations have been, I believe, compromised by a belief in positive liberties. So you get a right to health care, or a right to you get self-expression rights, like to go on a pride march or so on and so forth. So it's not just the negative right that homosexuality, for example, should be decriminalised. It's a positive right to express it in public as well. And I actually think in many respects, human rights and civil liberties, because so much of the human rights space has been colonised by positive rights, that really are, you can have this, you can have that, you should have these things. That you finish up with them being, and Isaiah Berlin actually, when he wrote his original famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty, he said that these two are going to come into conflict. If you have too many of the positive rights, they're going to come into conflict. Because in order for people to say, have a human right to health care, you finish up starting to instruct people to live in a particular way. And we're familiar with this historically because of the anti-smoking and anti-obesity and sugar tax and that kind of thing. And that just looks silly and trivial and so on and so forth. But it's quite possible to ramp that up significantly. So you finish up with things like lockdowns, and then at the extreme, compulsory medical procedures, which is...
well, what we're possibly facing.
Yeah, compulsory vaccination, which is what you've started to see in European countries and certainly in China, the more authoritarian countries.
Authoritarian countries. Right, now, I've never been to Australia. I should add, by the way, as you've mentioned, you live here, don't you? You moved here in...
Well, I've been back and forth between Australia and the UK since I was 4.
Right.
So I'm a dual national. My father was Scottish, my mother was Irish. I was born in Australia, but I have always had lifelong connections in both directions. I went to university in Australia, did my classics degree there, but I also went to university here. I did my law degree at Oxford. So I am as deeply rooted in both cases as it is possible to be.
Right. Well, therefore, your perspective will be particularly important to us. I look out, having never been to Australia, but I have an image of it, of being one of rugged individualism and also no nonsense. These are possible cliches that have gone with the same way as Dame Edna Everage. I don't know. But it has been so surprising of all countries to see the kind of things that seem to have been happening, well, with civil liberties and the police or whatever in Australia. Now, does it surprise you at all? I mean, am I wrong to feel this? Or do you see that actually this is exactly the way Australia would deal with this?
It's possible to be surprised by some aspects of the Australian response, but not by very many of them. Australia is a very distinctive polity. It has a very unusual approach to politics and a very unusual approach to civil society and to governance. That doesn't mean that it's so weird that it's more like China than Britain. It is obviously more like Britain, and it's not just the English language. But it is a very unusual country, and to be fair, many Australians, even when they first go overseas, don't realise how different their country is until they've spent quite a bit of time overseas. I mean, I started to experience it as a teenager. I realised, actually, no, other countries are very different from Australia. They do things very, very differently. They value different things. I wrote a long piece at the end of 2020 for Standpoint magazine, which was both praising some Australian qualities, but also provide an attempt to provide a warning to people. And so I was saying to those Americans who want to copy Australia's gun laws, or to those British people who want to copy Australia's immigration policy, or to many countries all over the world that want to copy the Australian healthcare system. All of these things are good things. They have, you know, the country is extremely well governed, and it's also a shock to the system if you've come out of a particular political tradition that says, for example, oh, you can't centrally plan an immigration policy. Well, Australia can and does and has done since 1991, and it's the most successful immigration policy in the world. So you can take your Hayek and his knowledge problem and you can stick it where the sun don't shine, to use an Australian expression. Yes, Australians are no nonsense. They will be like that. So it's a very unideological approach to governance, but it's not that third wayism of Tony Blair. It is just this brutal kind of pragmatism. The poet A.D. Hope described it as the people who live in Australia are the people who will inhabit the dying earth. You know, they are the last people who will be alive, basically. Everyone else will have died, but the Australians will still be there because they're survivors.
Along with Cher, of course.
Okay, that's good. I'll pay that one.
Okay.
So these are good things. You can have that idea in your head if you're Joe Biden and you're horrified about school shooters, if you're Priti Patel and you're horrified about migrants coming across in the channel in small boats, or if you're horrified about both the NHS and the American healthcare system. You could look at the Aussie thing and say, these are good things to have, but there's a price to pay. If you want those good things, you may have to, and this is the warning I tried to sound in my Standpoint piece, which is available for free. You can just go on their website and search my name and you'll find the article. Yes. Yeah. It's called Emulate Australia, ? And you may have to give up things that you find in your own culture in order to do the things that Australia does that you find very precious. And I have tried to warn people, to get this across to people without criticising Australia's remarkable achievements, but also to point out to them that it is a very distinctive country with a very distinctive culture. And there are some things you would have to do, for example, the American electoral system would have to be completely replaced and rebuilt from the ground up, probably with Australian advisors, in order to reproduce some of the qualities that the likes of across the spectrum, everyone from, you had Barack Obama praising the healthcare system, you had Donald Trump praising the immigration system, you've got Joe Biden praising the gun laws. So For example, in Australia, voting is compulsory. Civic education is compulsory. It uses compulsory preferential, what the Americans call instant runoff, and what here is called the alternative vote. But it's compulsory alternative vote. You have to number all the boxes. And everyone is compelled to the polls. If you don't go to the polls, you are fined. So it drags the Australian political system to the centre. Yeah. And I don't mean centre in the terms of boring centrist. I mean centre in that you cannot produce a situation where, for example, working class voters who are hostile to immigration, as we saw in the Brexit vote here, are just systematically ignored. Because if you do that in Australia, it will rip the base out from underneath of one of the major political parties. So that, in many respects, the Aussie system has roots in compulsory voting. Not only is it compulsory voting, redistribution, all the fights in America over redistricting, and you finish up with electoral systems that are sort of roughly shaped like a spiral or a banana to try and get all the Democrats in one seat and all the Republicans in another. And there's trade-offs between the two. Both parties are equally guilty of this. They're all impartially decided in Australia, basically by algorithm. And before every election, you finish up with the same number of people, and any kind of electoral apportionment is structured in such a way that it is impossible to favour one side or another. It's impossible to have a gerrymander at the federal level. It used to be possible at the state level. I experienced this growing up in Queensland, but it is no longer. You tell an American, by the way, all the horse trading over congressional districts, give it up. You have to give it up. All your voting laws that you have about, whether it's voter ID or getting people out to vote or so on and so forth, you have to give them all up. You have to have compulsory registration. The Electoral Commission comes around to Australian high schools and registers all the students when they're 16 and 17, so that as soon as they turn 18, they're flagged as a voter. So it involves thinking about politics, and that's just one tiny area. There are many, many other areas as well, and you notice it's based on compulsion. Australia doesn't have a pensions crisis. Nearly every other Western developed country does. It has a system known as superannuation. It has had it since 1991, compulsory saving when you work. Right. But do you see the compulsion again? It's this, Australians work out a good way to do something, and they think, oh, everybody should have that, but people are too stupid to necessarily choose that, so we'll choose for them. So it's a form of forced choosing. This is profoundly, profoundly different from any other political tradition. And if you look at the Australian constitutional debates, which I acknowledge many Australians are not familiar with the 19th century constitutional debates, but lawyers typically are. I mean, I was taught them. You learn about them. You study constitutional law in Australia because it has a written, entrenched constitutional document like the Americans do, with no human rights in it. And there you go. The only state in Australia with entrenched human rights in a form that would make sense to either an American or to someone from the European Union with the ECHR is Victoria. And that has been the state with the worst human rights abuses, or the worst civil liberties abuses. I'll correct myself there, because human rights and civil liberties are in certain respects contraindicated. And I think that it is probably only possible to guarantee civil liberties. I'm not sure you can guarantee human rights. And I'm put in mind of some comments made by my jurisprudence tutor at Oxford. He was Professor John Gardner. And he said, universal health care is a good thing to have. Don't pretend that it's not. But also, is it a right? Are you elevating to the status of rights things that are simply good things to have? And that has been why you've had your human rights organisations basically looking everywhere and looking under their armpit and not doing anything in the face of, say, lockdowns. That's the most obvious thing.
I think that's fascinating. This compulsion culture it sort of goes hand in hand with conformity, maybe, does it? In a way. I'm just wondering, because when you see, for example, and I know it's different to when you go to different territories in Australia, but when you see the way that the police have behaved, for example, and it seems to have public backing on the whole, does it not? I mean, despite the demonstration. Is that an expression of what you're talking about?
Australian policing is distinctively authoritarian. The police in Australia are closer to the gendarmerie in France than they are to the bobby on the beat here.
Yeah.
I think that is an obvious thing to say, and I've attempted to explain this previously to other media outlets, and I shall try here. There has been a long history in Australia of very authoritarian policing, going back before Federation. Federation was when all the states joined together to become the one country in 1901, but before that there was the state of colony of Queensland, the colony of New South Wales, colony of South Australia, and so on, and colony of Van Diemen's Land, which then became Tasmania, that kind of thing. There has been a long history of very authoritarian policing, and there were even things that you tend to associate with South America now, like really quite nasty conflicts between civil society and the police, and something that almost approached what we would consider to be a military coup. Yeah. If you look at what happened to Governor Bligh, yes, Bligh as in Mutiny on the Bounty. I'm not going to go into all the history here, but it's well worth doing. Just go to Wikipedia or something like that and look up what happened to Governor Bligh, and you will see the very famous picture of the New South Wales Court, because Governor Bligh hid under his bed in the Governor's Mansion, being hauled out from under his bed by members of the New South Wales Court in an incident known as the Rum Rebellion, where rum had become a currency in the colony. So this very authoritarian policing has deep roots, and the funny line that is being used, misattributed to Clive James, he didn't actually say it, but it is generally acknowledged that Peter Ustinov said a version of it, but I have heard it ever since I was a little girl, from my dad, is always remember that Australians are not only the descendants of convicts, they're also the descendants of their jailers. So this long history of very authoritarian policing, and sometimes too, I experienced this as a girl growing up in Queensland, a very corrupt policing. Lots and lots of brown paper bags, lots and lots of money changing hands, and association and corruption in the context of prostitution and gambling. One of the reasons why Australia was one of the first countries in the world to go down the path of decriminalisation with prostitution was precisely to take it out of the hands of the police, because the police were as bent as bobby pins. And you can once again read it on the internet, but it goes back to the 70s and 80s. You can read the report of the Wood Royal Commission into the New South Wales Police Force, which was famously and notoriously described as a joke as the best police force that money could buy, because of this cultural tradition. Now, it is generally acknowledged that the most authoritarian police force in Australia now is Victoria Police, and it took over from the Queensland Police, who were cleaned up, less authoritarian now, and that is why the worst stuff you've seen in terms of reporting over here, and including the incident with the rubber bullets, has occurred in Victoria. In the context of the COVID pandemic, Victoria has also had the worst outcomes of any Australian state, and the longest lockdowns. It's so extreme that Victoria at one point had something like 230 odd days of continuous lockdown, while Queensland had 3 days in total. So there are huge variations between the individual states, because that's another thing. I don't know whether you have any American viewers. So Americans will get this better than British people who are unitary state. Australia is a federal system, and there is considerable divergence between the states. So you could have a state in Australia, South Australia was like this, for example, that was kind of like Florida, and nothing was locked down, and it was very liberal, and so on and so forth. And then you could have a state like Victoria, where the capital city, Melbourne, actually had the longest period of continuous lockdown in the developed world. And those states abut each other. Victoria and South Australia share a border. So it gives you an idea, within one country you can get this incredible divergence. But just for, if you're an American, imagine if Florida and California were next to each other rather than separated by a continent.
Exactly, or New York indeed. The big cities are much more. It's also the Northern Territory as well. That's pretty harsh, isn't it, when it comes to...
It hasn't Now, the thing
is where these confinement camps are.
Oh, the thing in the Northern Territory is it's a territory, not a state. So constitutionally, it has less power over its own affairs than the states do. And this is worked out, this arrangement is worked out in the Constitution. So the Northern Territory and the Australian Capital Territory are the two territories. The main thing in terms of representation is they only get 2 senators each, whereas the other states get 12 each in the Parliament, in the federal Parliament.
Is that down to population?
It's a mainly population, but there are a few other little indicia as well, which I won't go into because they'll just bore you. But so the Northern Territory, the main claim to fame of the Northern Territory is that it has the largest, as a proportion of the state's population, number of Aboriginal people who are the Indigenous people of Australia. And they are very, very distinctive. Aborigines are really, really distinctive. Even in the context of forager civilisations all over the world, Aborigines are really, really unusual. It's generally acknowledged that they've been in Australia for about 40,000 years, give or take. The culture is very unusual. It's not unified. They speak many different languages. They're not like the Maori in New Zealand. When the British went to New Zealand, they discovered the Maori. One of the reasons why the Maori provided such an effective resistance during the Maori Wars is they all spoke the same language. It was all mutually intelligible and they were very, very organised. Aborigines, they're like hundreds of languages, all these small tribal groups in a very harsh environment. And so what the Northern Territory has done, and I'm not going to excuse it here because I think that there has been overreach, and the young woman who was interviewed on Unheard, who was basically locked up because she told a lie, so she was effectively imprisoned without a trial. Yeah, that's egregious. She was, the expression that's used in Australia is that she was verbaled by the police, so painted into a corner and finished up being locked up in Howard Springs. That's egregious. You can't excuse that. But the panic in the Northern Territory is born of the terrible fear that if coronavirus gets into the remote Aboriginal communities, it will have a catastrophic effect. And I probably need to explain a little bit of genetics here. Many educated Americans and British people are familiar with the Columbian Exchange, which the shorthand is, we gave the Native Americans, both North and South America, smallpox, and they gave us syphilis. This was not a good experience for people on either side, but while syphilis makes you very sick, smallpox kills you, and so it had an awful effect on those populations. However, colds and flu, coronavirus and influenza, were already endemic in those populations. When European colonists went to Australia, not only did the Aborigines have no experience of smallpox, there was no colds or flu there either. And often you get people ask, why didn't the Aborigines resist so effectively? The Maori nearly beat Whitey, you know, in New Zealand. And a big part of the reason, it's not the only part, I mean, the fact that they didn't speak mutually intelligible languages is part of this as well, but a big part of it is because all the battles against the Aborigines weren't won by the colonists. They were won by general coronavirus and general influenza. And that memory is very strong in the Aboriginal communities. It was then repeated in 1918 and 1919. The Aboriginal people, their populations had just started to recover from settlement, basically. This is what happens when half of you get wiped out. And then they were flattened again by Spanish flu. And that is seared into the country's memory. It was a disaster. And whilst there was a lot of racism in Australia in 1918, as there was in lots of other countries, nobody on any side of politics or out of any particular background wanted to see the Aboriginal people die out. So Australians were horrified at what Spanish flu did to the Aboriginal populations. So that panicked and very authoritarian response in the Northern Territory is a combination of the country's political history and policing history. That is an element of that. That is true, as I was describing earlier. But it's also terrible, panicked fear that once again, the original colonial power will screw it up when it comes to the Indigenous population and lead finish up with vast numbers of them dying. Because even though modern Aborigines are the descendants of people who survived colds and flu, they've only got 230 years of that. They don't have thousands upon thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of years like Europeans and East Asians do, who are the majority of the rest of the Aussie population, in terms of building up genetic resistance and biological resistance to colds and flu.
So if you understand all of that, I mean, extremely vivid portrayal of the background, then I suppose it means you are quite understanding as to why Australia has reacted to the way it has.
I understand it, but I see why it's alarming. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I completely understand. I mean, and I see why that video, the interview with the young woman who's originally from Victoria and moved to another part of the country to get away from Victoria's long lockdowns, and she was in Melbourne, which was where they were very bad. I completely understand why someone would do that, and her alarm and distress. I mean, I saw as a young woman and as a teenager the behaviour of the Queensland police, and they astonishingly authoritarian behaviour. I've had the experience of being arrested on an illegal pride march. It was not fun. I'll just leave it there. Okay.
Well, I mean, what happened to you?
Well, basically everybody was arrested and we were all strip searched.
Right.
Yeah, this is in the days of Joh Bjelke-Petersen when he was the Premier. He was a shocker for this. You know, very, very authoritarian government. Queensland, the chant that people, when I was a girl, would be Queensland Police State demand the right to demonstrate. Queensland Police State demand the right to demonstrate. Because at one point there was legislation that if you gathered in more than a group of 3, the police could come and break you up.
Right.
And there was this awful, awful joke that went around at about that time, that if you got 3 Victorians together, they'd talk about the football. If you got 3 South Australians together, they would form a modern family because they had a gay premier at the time. This is what I mean about state differences. If you got 3 Tasmanians together, they were all related. If you got 3 West Australians together, you'd have an international business corporation because of all the iron ore. And the jokes about, and there were jokes about the other states, but the ones for the Northern Territory and Queensland were vicious. If you get 3 Queenslanders together, they'll get arrested. And if you get 3 Northern Territorians together, they'll blame it on the bloody dingo. and I think even here, people will get the dingo joke. These are the. It's a shorthand way of describing the differences between the states. So I understand where the Northern Territory government is coming from, but I still find it alarming. And it is a shock to foreigners who've had this idea in their head, including for part of the pandemic, where basically hardly anyone in Australia died. And even by comparison with the rest of the world, probably Australia has had the most successful pandemic response. Even Victoria, the worst performing Australian state, is substantially better than nearly everybody else in the world. And you get other states where like 1 person's died, all that kind of thing. And so people can look at this country and go, gee, it's well run, isn't it nice, isn't it clean? People go there and think, oh, it's so clean, it's so nice and everything works and so on and so forth. But there is that, the price you pay for getting all the trains to run on time is this very orderly, form-filling, compliant, not so much compliant as conformist. There is an Australian expression that has got, there are several of them that have gone global. I've talked, I finished up talking on one outlet about dead cats. Plan B is to distract from Boris's flat and from parties in number 10 amongst the great and the good. And so they've introduced Plan B, and the Australian joke is Plan B is the dead cat you throw on the table. It's to stop people talking about the embarrassing thing to the government so that they can say, because everyone's running around like a mad thing going, look, there's a dead cat on the table. Now that's from Australian politics. Now,
that's one hell of a dead cat.
It's a huge dead cat, yes. It's a Maine Coon. It takes up the whole table. It's massive. Now, the other expression that started in Australia but has now become global, I think even Americans will have heard of this, is the tall poppy syndrome. Now, this is an immense part of Australian culture, and the Japanese translation of it is, I actually think, more vivid. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down flat,
right,
is the way it will be translated into Japanese. Because Japan has elements of this as well, but it's expressed in the context of East Asian, Confucian, Buddhist, Shinto culture rather than a broadly liberal, democratic, Christian, Jewish kind of little bit of Muslim culture in Australia. And the tall poppy syndrome, explained, is the country, it's not socialist. Nobody has any issue with you making lots of money in Australia, having a very good life. If you're very clever or entrepreneurial or very talented, knock yourself out, make a fortune. Australia has no issue with that. So it's not socialist kind of envy, politics of envy. It's not like that. The tall poppy syndrome is, if you have a special talent or trait or skill, you can make a lot of money out of it and get a lot of respect, but you can't demand respect, and you can't demand that you be treated better or be given more chances or more deference on the basis of your talent or skill. Now, this will make more sense to British people, and I'm sorry I don't have a good example for Americans. You'll have to look it up. But you may, if you're British and you're playing an Ashes series against Australia at the moment, remember the sandpaper incident with ball tampering by members of the Australian cricket team, including the then captain at the time, Steve Smith, one of probably the best batsmen in the world still. He's just fantastically gifted. Nobody in Australia had any issue with Steve Smith being fantastic, making lots of money, getting huge kudos for being gifted at his sport and for being captain of the cricket team, which is just like massive. If you're Canadian, like it's like being the captain of the Maple Leafs. It's just huge. But as soon as he arrogated to himself the right to behave in a way that was not an expression of his talent, but rather, I am the skipper of the team, therefore I will bend the rules, it created an enormous outburst and outrage and anger in Australia, because that is the tall poppy syndrome coming into effect.
Yeah, I mean, here you see, Helen, it's a slightly, I think the meaning was always slightly different. It might have changed, but it was, because Stats used to use it, as well. It's essentially that if you looked like you had particular initiative and not necessarily just talent, actually, but you wanted to get on, then there was resentment amongst other people. Who do you think you are? It didn't require you to do anything, like to do that, tampering with the ball and everything. It was actually much more, if you were kind of like, I'm going to make something of myself, and then somehow people would start to get jealous. Like the socialism is the politics of envy kind of argument.
Australia doesn't really have that politics of envy. What it has is the tall poppy syndrome. Remember in the Brexit context of the Brexit debate, this happened a little bit in the United States with Trump as well, where a lot of people who were quite well educated, who'd been to good universities and so on and so forth, were saying extraordinary things like, these people vote, these people shouldn't vote, these people are too stupid to vote, that kind of thing. Anybody with any sort of career in public life in Australia who said that in the response to an electoral result of any sort, and remember Australia uses referendums because that's the only way you can change the constitution, that would be the end. They would be out of public life.
Right.
You cannot, that is also the operation of the tall poppy syndrome. You can't arrogate to yourself because you're very clever or you went to Oxford or Cambridge or whatever.
Right.
The ability to say, I'm smarter than you, therefore I get to tell you what to do. This is so bad. It's probably a little less than it was, but only a little bit, because I've got friends with teenage children who describe this phenomenon. If you are very clever at an Australian school and you then, on the basis of your cleverness, attempt to tell other people what to do, if you are a boy 100 out of 100%, you will get the snot flogged out of you in the playground.
Yeah.
If you are a girl, and you know that girls are less violent, you're likely to still stand probably a good 1 in 2 chance of somebody going whack around your face. Don't you dare sit down. So that's the way the tall poppy syndrome operates in Australia. And it is, and that is quite close to what when you're quoting from Thatcher, is quite close to the how very dare you get above yourself. But if you're very clever and you go on and you make lots of money, problem with that. I made stacks of money out of my first book, and I got some envy from other writers who didn't have a bestseller, but it wasn't particularly nasty envy. The controversy over my first novel was all over your sort of cultural appropriation and that kind of thing. It wasn't how very dare you write a bestseller. You know, nobody cared about that.
This is the hand that signed the paper, isn't it?
My
the hand
first
that signed the paper. And just briefly, Hannah, can you explain to people who don't know? But it was a real literary cause celeb, wasn't it?
Well, yes. And what I did is I wrote a feature because there was a 20th anniversary edition that came out a few years ago that you can still get off of Amazon or at Waterstones or Blackwell's or whatever. You've got no problem getting it there. And I wrote an essay